Was told I had an 8.5-hour shift and not to leave early, so I started working for only 8.5 hours. I work as a supervisor at a manufacturing plant, and I was hired for an 8-hour shift as the nighttime supervisor. As soon as I started, they changed and said they really considered the shift to be from 11 p.m. to 7:30, so they would need it to be 8.5 hours. I'm salaried, there wasn't much I could do, and it wasn't a big deal, so I said okay. As I get into a groove working there, I find out that the second shift supervisor is a train wreck. No one would describe him to me, just saying I had to meet him. He leaves an hour or two early from his shift 2 to 3 times a week. Friday nights he leaves the plant at 5:30, and tells them to call him if there are any problems. He calls out, at a minimum, once a week. It's psychotic. Every time he is out, I come in at around 8 p.m. to cover the last 3 hours of his shift and my full shift. At least once a week, I just do it. I figure the company is going to deal with it, but as time passes, they obviously aren't. Structurally, the company is just as bad as him. Infighting, rivalries, backstabbing, all of that, but I stay on nights so I don't see it much. Then Sarah starts as my boss. I actually have 2 bosses, which is how every successful employee works. Sarah is a nightmare. Sarah wants me to work 11 to 11 on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and 11 to 10 on Friday. I dig in my heels, document like crazy, and after a couple months of harassment, HR actually backs me up and she has to stop. But now Sarah is angry, and she sees me leaving at 7:15 one morning after coming in 2 hours early. She sends an email clarifying our time expectations. Second shift train wreck calls in that night, so I come in at 8, and the next morning, Sarah sees me leave at 7:10. I get an email saying she is coming in early to talk to me, and when she shows up, I'm getting a formal warning for my early departures, going into my personnel file. I've never been written up in my life. During the meeting, with HR in attendance, she said I am expected to be there for my 8.5-hour shift. I made sure that the expectation was on record for an 8.5-hour shift, which HR documented. The next week, the second shift supervisor is out 2 days. After the first day, Sarah asks me the next morning why I didn't come in early, as there were problems on his shift, and I said I fulfilled my 8.5-hour shift, and I'm not responsible for his. They had to hire a contractor at $125 an hour to cover all of his missed time, which amounted to 19 weeks this past year. Eventually they hired a 4th supervisor at $85,000 per year to cover his gaps. Sarah got demoted, and I only ever work 8.5 hours.
Now to the comments. Would have been cheaper to fire the bad supervisor and get a new one. Also, you should keep your resume updated for when the plague ends and places are hiring.
OP replied, I am constantly looking, and praying that corporations don't act like corporations and dramatically lower salaries for new employees.
Every shitty company I've worked, the senior employees complained about working there, the conditions, everything, but they couldn't afford to take the pay cut of going to a new company. That's what they get for playing duck-duck games. Wage theft is one of the most common crimes and it can happen to salaried employees too.
OP replied, we were arguing at one point about her time expectations, and she said you're a salaried employee. There are no time protections for you. If I ask you to work, you have to work. I responded by saying okay, then let's head over to HR right now and make sure that's the correct policy to pursue. They wound up sending her to management training, but I don't think it really took.
It would become very difficult for me to find my phone, at that point, during 7:30 to 11. I had also done the 11 to 7:30, and also would come in during the afternoon some days when it got really busy, and would work a 6th night every other weekend. My annual review said my hours were satisfactory 2 years in a row doing that, so, I stopped all the OT for a year. That year, I got satisfactory. Never lifted a finger to help again. Also worked that overnight with just one other person, and we both were told we should have a higher number of support calls taken. I asked how that would happen on an overnight shift when we already field 100% of the calls, and was given a needs improvement for that one every year. When I finally was able to leave that job, I actually was asked why I would quit. I knew I was never coming back and never working in the field again, so I just told them the job was only satisfactory and I really wanted one I thought was good.
Hell, if it's just the two of you and you need to take more support calls, just have one of you call the other until you get to your magic number.
When I was in college shadowing the IT guy, they changed how they did support tickets. They were told they didn't have a quota. Only to be told they need to do minimum 30 tickets a day. This wasn't a big school, maybe 20 employees at most and about 100 students, so his supervisor told him and the other IT guys, different locations across the state, to log computers individually when they did their rounds. He would just walk up to a computer, restart it, and said that he fixed an unexplainable issue by restarting it. The guys that told them they needed to do 30 tickets a day never questioned it. What do you mean you don't want to come in for massive amounts of unpaid OT? We made you salary, you should be thankful. People blow my mind with the thought process of work expectations. Good for you.
OP replied. I grew up in an anti-union household. My grandfather had been a union welder for 40 years, and not long before he retired in the early 80s, a union official took off with the pension fund. It wiped him out. So, there was no love for unions in our house. I felt that way for 40 years, based on what was said while I was growing up. Now, I worked here for 3 years. Pro-union. Completely see their use, and why they're important. It's insane.
I wouldn't say I'm pro or anti-union. Like most things in life, they are only as good as the people in them. They serve a vital purpose, but there are also a lot that are corrupt, so it needs to be a case-by-case basis. How did the train wreck not get fired? That's theft of time and money if nothing else.
OP replied. He lives in a world without consequence, it would seem.
Yeah, I had a colleague for 8 years like this. We were technically the same title, but I actually managed the entire team, and he was not allowed to, because the one time we let him manage people they all quit within a month, and the work for his projects did not get done. But, as he put it, any ape with arms could do what you do, fun times. So he gets married within the first year he is there, but 3 to 4 years later they decide they need a real wedding, back in her home country, Europe, so he was supposed to take 5 weeks to do this thing. He disappeared for 4 months. No contact, at all. He swoops back 4 weeks before his government contract project is supposed to wrap up, and expects everyone else to drop every other project to support his. Again, fun times. Then he proceeds to come in from 10 to 2, 1 to 2 days a week for the next 3 to 4 years, often going weeks with no show. I get told I need to manage him. We are the same level? I made less money than he did, my PhD was not worth as much as his, supposedly. Even though I brought in 4 times as much money, our boss would tell our team that he was working from home. I had been friends with his wife before the re-wedding mess. I just could not deal with disappearing for 4 months and no consequences, or his attitude when he finally did come back, so I just stopped hanging out with them. So we were friends on Facebook. Though home looks an awful lot like Zion, Yellowstone, Yosemite, etc. When I finally hit my last nerve and quit, I went on a long walk with him. We were actually somewhat friendly. His wife and I were friends before the whole re-wedding debacle. I stopped hanging out with them because of that behavior. I asked him WTF was up with not showing up for weeks at a time, etc. He said, "You know." No one ever said anything after the wedding. he fully expected to come back and be fired. But he did not even get talked to. So he just kept doing it. It made his life easier, and he could spend time with his wife and kids, and travel, so why not? I about died. For years our bosses, a married couple, would witch loudly about where was X, like we were all his keepers, etc. And they never spoke to him. I mean, I suddenly was not angry at his abusing the system, man. In fact, it was another month or two before I could quit, but I started hanging in my office reading trashy romance novels and applying to jobs, helping my team apply for jobs and go on interviews, etc. I chewed through my sick time. I think I took 8 days of sick time in 4 weeks before giving notice. I was so over that whole mess. But I was somewhat in awe that someone would push the system that far and just keep going. I mean, I would too if I never got written up or warned to knock it off. You did well ensuring things were documented with HR.
OP replied. I had a 15-page Word document. My favorite part? She asked me why I was unwilling to extend my hours, and I said I have a specific sleep schedule so I can see my children. She asked how old my children are, and I said 12, 14, and 17. Her response was, they're all basically teenagers, do they even want to hang out with you anymore? I kept my cool, and said yes, we're a tight-knit family. She then asked me for examples of how we were tight-knit. I told her I am not required to justify the time I spend with my family, and into the Word document it went.
What the duck? That made me angry just reading it. These people really think they own your whole life.